Imagine living in the greatest city on earth, a city you believe is eternal, protected by the gods and the might of the most powerful army the world has ever seen. For 800 years, that city, Rome, had not been breached by a foreign enemy. Its walls were a symbol of absolute security, its very existence a guarantee of order in a chaotic world. Now, imagine waking up on a hot August night in the year 410 AD. The unthinkable is happening. The eternal city is under siege. The people you once called barbarians are pounding at the gates. How did it come to this? How did the mightiest empire in history find itself completely at the mercy of the people it once dismissed as uncivilized savages? This is the story of Rome under siege, a story of desperate emperors, warrior kings, and the catastrophic chain of events that brought a civilization to its knees. Welcome to Roman Empire. Today, we are diving deep into one of the most pivotal and dramatic periods in human history, the Barbarian Invasions. For centuries, the Roman Empire stood as a colossal superpower, stretching from Britain to the Middle East. But by the late 4th and early 5th centuries, this colossus was crumbling. It wasn't just one invasion that did Rome in, it was a perfect storm of climate change, mass migration, political corruption, and military failure. We will trace the epic migrations of the Goths, the Vandals, and the Huns. We will stand on the walls with the defenders during the sieges and ride with the invaders as they carve out new kingdoms. By the end of this video, you will understand not just how Rome fell, but how the barbarians didn't just destroy an empire, they forged the foundation of modern Europe. Let's turn back the clock to a world under siege. To understand the fall, we have to understand the barbarians themselves. The term comes from the Greek word barbaros, meaning a non-Greek speaker, someone whose language sounded like unintelligible barbar to their ears. The Romans inherited this term and applied it broadly to the tribes living beyond their frontiers, primarily across the Rhine and Danube rivers. But who were these people? They weren't a single unified enemy. They were a vast tapestry of diverse cultures and tribal groups. To the north, you had the Saxons, Franks, and Frisians. To the east, beyond the Danube, were the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the powerful confederations of the Goths, who were further divided into the Visigoths, Western Goths, and Ostrogoths, Eastern Goths. They were farmers, herders, and exceptional warriors. Their societies were built around kinship and loyalty to a chieftain. For centuries, the relationship between Rome and these tribes was a mix of trade, diplomacy, and brutal conflict. Roman legions would march into Germania to punish raiders, and sometimes the tribes would push back. In the 2nd century BC, the Romans had faced the Cimbri and Teutones. Julius Caesar himself had fought the migrating Helvetii and the Suebian king Ariovistus. The Romans built a massive fortified border system called the Limes to keep them out. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the dynamic began to shift. The empire, plagued by civil wars and economic troubles, started to rely more and more on these very same barbarians to fill the ranks of its legions. Germanic warriors became valued soldiers, and some even rose to high ranks in the Roman army. The frontier was becoming blurred. The barbarians were no longer just outside the gates. They were inside the camp. The world of late 4th century Europe was like a powder keg, and the spark that lit the fuse came from the east, the Huns. These formidable mounted warriors, originating from the steppes of Central Asia, began migrating westward, and their arrival sent shockwaves through the Germanic tribes. The Huns were unlike anything the Germans or Romans had ever seen. Their speed, their skill with the composite bow from horseback, and their terrifying reputation for destruction caused mass panic. In 375 AD, the Huns crushed the powerful Ostrogothic kingdom north of the Black Sea. This victory pushed the Ostrogoths into the territories of their kin, the Visigoths. The Visigoths, led by their chieftain Fritigern, faced a terrifying choice: stand and fight the Huns and likely be annihilated, or seek refuge elsewhere. They chose the latter. In 376 AD, tens of thousands of Visigoths gathered on the banks of the Danube, the northern border of the Roman Empire. They sent a desperate plea to the Roman Emperor Valens in Constantinople. They asked for asylum. The Romans saw an opportunity. Here was a massive pool of potential recruits and farmers. Valens agreed to let them cross into the empire and settle as federati, allied peoples who would defend the border in exchange for land and food. The crossing of the Danube was one of the most significant moments in history. But the Roman officials tasked with managing the influx were corrupt and cruel. They exploited the desperate Goths, forcing them to trade their children into slavery for scraps of rotten dog meat. They herded them into squalid camps with no supplies. Within months, the Visigoths were starving and seething with rage. The Romans had made a catastrophic error. They had created a massive armed and angry army inside their own borders. When the Roman commander Lupicinus invited Fritigern to a feast, presumably to assassinate him, fighting broke out. The rebellion had begun. Fritigern rallied his people, and they began ravaging the countryside of Thrace. Emperor Valens, who was in Antioch, had to respond. He gathered his main army and marched west, eager to crush this uprising himself and deny the glory to his young nephew and co-emperor Gratian, who was also marching to help. Valens arrived outside the city of Adrianople, modern-day Edirne in Turkey, on August 9th, 378 AD, and found the Visigoths encamped in a fortified wagon circle, or lager. Confident in his elite legions and believing the Goths numbered only 10,000, Valens refused to wait for Gratian's reinforcements. He ordered an immediate attack. What happened next was a military disaster of unimaginable scale. The Roman army, tired and thirsty from a long march under the hot sun, arrived to find the Gothic army far larger than anticipated. The attack was poorly coordinated. While the Roman right wing advanced, the left wing lagged behind. At that critical moment, the Ostrogoth cavalry, which had arrived to join Fritigern, thundered down from the nearby hills and slammed into the exposed Roman flank. The Roman lines collapsed. The legions were cut down in the panic. Emperor Valens himself was either killed by a Gothic sword or burned to death in a hut where he had taken shelter. Adrianople was the worst Roman defeat since Cannae 600 years earlier. It shattered the myth of Roman military superiority and proved that barbarian armies could destroy a Roman imperial army in a fair fight. For the next 30 years, the Roman Empire struggled to contain the Goths. A new leader emerged among the Visigoths, Alaric. He was a brilliant and ambitious king who wanted more than just land for his people. He wanted official recognition and a high-ranking position in the Roman military hierarchy. Time and again, Roman generals would make deals with him, only to break them. Alaric led his people on a rampage through Greece and repeatedly invaded Italy. Opposing him was the great Roman general Stilicho. Stilicho was himself of Vandal background, a perfect example of the barbarized Roman military. He was the last great defender of the Western Empire. He managed to defeat Alaric on several occasions, but was always forced by political intrigue in the imperial court to let him go. In 408 AD, the paranoid emperor Honorius, safely ensconced in the impregnable swamps of Ravenna, believed the rumors that Stilicho planned to usurp his throne. He had the loyal general arrested and executed. With Stilicho dead, Alaric saw his chance. He had no powerful Roman army left to stop him. He marched on Rome itself. Rome was no longer the capital. That had moved to Milan and then to Ravenna. But it was still the symbolic heart of the empire, the Eternal City. In 408, Alaric's forces surrounded the city. The Romans were completely unprepared for a siege. Food supplies dwindled, famine set in, followed by plague. The Romans resorted to desperate measures. even paying a huge ransom for the city to be spared, which Alaric accepted, hoping to negotiate a settlement with Honorius. But Honorius, from his safe palace, refused to negotiate. After 2 more failed attempts to reach an agreement, Alaric had had enough. On the night of August 24, 410 AD, something happened. Accounts say that slaves opened the Salarian gate to the Goths. For the first time in 800 years, the city of Rome was being sacked by a foreign enemy. The Visigoths poured into the city. They looted, they burned, and they took prisoners, including the emperor's own sister, Galla Placidia. While Alaric, who was a Christian, ordered his men to respect the churches, the psychological impact was immeasurable. The entire Roman world was shaken to its core. In Bethlehem, the church father Saint Jerome, who had dedicated his life to translating the Bible, broke down in despair, writing, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." The fall of Rome was a cataclysmic event, but it was not the end of the Western Empire yet. The Visigoths eventually moved on, settling in Gaul and then Spain. However, the precedent was set. The floodgates were open. Just as Alaric's Goths were settling down, another massive movement was happening further north. On the last day of December in 406 AD, a huge coalition of tribes, including the Vandals, Alans and Suebi, crossed the frozen Rhine River into Gaul. Unlike the Goths, who had sought a negotiated settlement, these groups were on the move, burning and looting as they went. They swept through Gaul and crossed the Pyrenees into Spain. A few years later, one of the most cunning and ruthless barbarian kings of all time emerged. Gaiseric, king of the Vandals. Seeing the Roman province of North Africa, the breadbasket of the empire that supplied grain to Rome and Italy, as a ripe plum ready to be plucked, Gaiseric led his entire people, estimated at around 80,000 souls, across the Strait of Gibraltar. In 439 AD, he captured Carthage, the richest city in the Western Empire. He built a Vandal navy and became the master of the Mediterranean, ravaging the coasts of Italy and Sicily. With the loss of North Africa, the Western Roman Empire was economically strangled. It could no longer pay its armies or feed its people. Meanwhile, other barbarian groups were carving out their own domains. The Burgundians settled in eastern Gaul. The Franks, who had been allowed to settle in the empire peacefully for generations, began expanding their power under their king Clovis. And in Britain, the Roman legions had long since departed, leaving the province open to invasion by the Angles, Saxons and Jutes from across the North Sea. In the mid-5th century, the Huns returned under their most famous leader, Attila. He rampaged through the Balkans and then turned his sights on Gaul and Italy. He was finally defeated, though not by Romans alone. A coalition of Romans under the general Flavius Aetius and the Visigoths under King Theodoric stopped him at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 AD. It was a final, desperate victory for a dying empire, an alliance of Romans and barbarians against a common, more terrible enemy. After Attila's death, the Hun threat evaporated, but the Roman Empire was a hollow shell. The real power in the West lay with barbarian generals like Ricimer, who controlled a series of puppet emperors. Finally, in 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer led a revolt of the barbarian soldiers in Italy. He deposed the boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus, whose name ironically combined the name of Rome's founder and its first emperor. Odoacer decided not to bother with a puppet. He sent the imperial regalia back to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needed an emperor. The Roman Senate agreed. The Roman Empire in the West was no more. In its place stood a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms: the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Vandals in Africa, the Ostrogoths, who later conquered Italy from Odoacer, and eventually the Lombards. So was it simply a case of barbarians at the gate that destroyed Rome? The reality is far more complex. The barbarian invasions were not a single event, but a 200-year-long process of migration, integration, and conflict. By the time Alaric sacked Rome, the empire was already fatally weakened by internal decay, political infighting, and an over-reliance on foreign soldiers. The barbarians didn't just break down the gates, they walked through them, sometimes as enemies, but often as allies, settlers, and defenders of a system they had come to admire. And in the end, they didn't just destroy. The fusion of Roman and Germanic cultures, laws, and traditions laid the very foundation for the medieval world and modern Europe. The kingdoms of the Franks would evolve into France and Germany. The laws of the Visigoths influenced Spanish culture. The Anglo-Saxons gave their name to England. The fall of Rome was a tragedy and a transformation. It was the end of the ancient world and the bloody, chaotic birth of our own. The eternal city fell, but its legacy, forever changed by the people who besieged it, lived on. Thank you for watching our deep dive into the Barbarian Invasions. We hope you enjoyed this journey through one of history's most fascinating turning points. If you want to see more content like this, exploring the rise and fall of empires and the epic stories that shaped our world, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video, where we'll be looking at the life of Charlemagne and the birth of a new European empire. Let us know in the comments below. Which barbarian leader do you think had the biggest impact on history? Alaric, Gaiseric, or Attila the Hun? We read your comments and love hearing your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.